Do you dare to step into the lair of America's first serial killer, H. Holmes, a man who built a hotel not to welcome guests, but to ensnare them in a living nightmare? You'll descend into a twisted maze of trapdoors, gas chambers, and soundproofed vaults where screams died in silence. The walls of his murder castle still whisper the horrors they witnessed. Will you brave the darkness that swallowed his victims whole? Enter if you dare, but know this: you may not escape the terror waiting inside. Chapter 1. The Devil in the White City. Herman Webster Mudgett, a name that doesn't exactly send chills down your spine. But if you knew the boy behind it, the one who would grow up to become H. Holmes, one of America's most notorious serial killers, you might feel differently. The man who would later be called the Devil in the White City was born in 1861 in a small, quiet town in New Hampshire. The story goes that little Herman was a strange child, reserved, intelligent, and with a piercing gaze that seemed to see right through you. But beneath that quiet demeanor lurked something sinister. As a child, Herman was often bullied by his peers. When they found out he was terrified of the town doctor's office, they did what children do best. They found a way to make his worst fears come true. One day, they dragged the trembling boy into the doctor's office, forcing him to touch the skeletal remains that decorated the place. Herman screamed, expecting his heart to stop from sheer terror. But something unexpected happened. As his trembling fingers brushed against the bones, his fear transformed into fascination. He later described it as the moment when he first learned that death held no power over him. That incident planted a seed in young Herman's mind, and the boy who had once been a victim began to take a darker turn. He became fascinated with anatomy, experimenting with small animals, studying them, dissecting them, even killing them. But it wasn't just a morbid curiosity. Herman learned to wear a mask of innocence, using his intelligence and charm to manipulate those around him. It was a skill that would later serve him all too well. By the time he reached adulthood, Herman had shed his old name like a snake shedding its skin. He became Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, a man of many faces. In some places, he was a charming young pharmacist, in others a respectable doctor, and in others still, a loving husband. Yes, husband, because Holmes didn't stop at one marriage. He had several, each wife unaware of the other's existence. Each wife, of course, was a means to an end, a source of money, a pawn in his schemes, or worse, an eventual victim. Holmes drifted from city to city, conning people out of their money, disappearing just before they realized what had happened. And then he arrived in Chicago, a city of opportunity, a city of dreams, and for Holmes, a city ripe for the picking. In 1893, Chicago was booming. The city was preparing for the grand event that would draw people from all corners of the country, the world's Columbian Exposition, also known as the Chicago World's Fair. It was to be a celebration of progress and innovation, a chance for America to show off its might and ingenuity. Skyscrapers reached for the heavens, electric lights shone brightly against the night sky, and the streets were filled with eager crowds. It was a spectacle that promised wonder and excitement. But beneath all the glamour and grandiose plans lay something darker. For amid the glittering exhibits and bustling streets, a predator was building his lair. Holmes, ever the opportunist, knew that the influx of tourists and job seekers to the city would provide the perfect cover for his schemes. He bought a large lot on the corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street, where he began constructing what would become his infamous murder castle. At first glance, it appeared to be a grand hotel, designed to accommodate the influx of visitors during the fair. But what lay inside was the stuff of nightmares. Holmes personally oversaw every aspect of the construction, hiring and firing several contractors to keep anyone from knowing the building's full layout. The result was a twisted labyrinth of windowless rooms, hidden staircases, and narrow corridors that seemed to go nowhere. There were doors that opened to brick walls, trapdoors that dropped into the basement, and chutes that led straight down to the cellar, his personal body dump. Chicago in the late 19th century was a bustling metropolis, but it was also a city of contradictions. Prosperity and poverty lived side by side. The streets teemed with life, but crime and corruption lurked in every shadow. It was the perfect place for a man like Holmes. With his smooth talk and cultured manner, he could charm the most cynical of people. He could convince a stranger to trust him with their life savings, or a young woman to follow him into the depths of his hotel without a second thought. Holmes' murder castle became a black hole that swallowed people whole. Young women, often alone and far from home, arrived in Chicago seeking jobs and new beginnings. Some of them found their way to Holmes' hotel, where they would vanish without a trace. The sheer volume of visitors to the city and the chaotic atmosphere of the fair meant that disappearances were easy to overlook. People came and went, often leaving no forwarding address, no family contact. It was a transient city, and Holmes used that to his advantage. As the fair continued to draw crowds, Holmes' hunger for death grew. He had created a maze designed to trap and kill, and he delighted in experimenting with new ways to dispatch his victims. He suffocated some in airtight chambers, gassed others in sealed rooms, and dismembered the unfortunate ones in his basement. And still, no one suspected a thing. To the outside world, Holmes was a successful businessman, a polite and charming host. But those who stayed at his hotel, those who wandered into his twisted web, never left. The basement of the murder castle was a macabre workshop filled with surgical instruments, vats of acid, and a crematorium where Holmes disposed of his victims' remains. He stripped the flesh from bones, sold skeletons to medical schools, and dissolved bodies until there was nothing left. The castle itself seemed to breathe with malevolence. Every creak of its floors and every whisper of wind through its halls a testament to the horrors that unfolded within. Holmes was, in every sense of the word, a monster hiding in plain sight. He thrived amid the chaos and anonymity of Chicago, feeding off the city's energy and its people's trust. By the time his reign of terror came to an end, it was too late for many who had crossed his path. The Chicago World's Fair was meant to be a beacon of hope, a symbol of progress and civilization. But beneath the light of the fair, Holmes cast a long, dark shadow, one that would forever stain the city's history with blood. And so, the devil in the White City carried out his dark deeds, his laughter echoing through the empty corridors of his murderous lair. The fair ended, the lights dimmed, and the crowds dispersed, but the horror of what had transpired in Holmes' castle would remain, a haunting reminder of what happens when evil wears the mask of respectability. Chapter 2. The construction of the murder castle. To say that H. Holmes built his murder castle with meticulous attention to detail would be an understatement. What he constructed was more than just a building. It was a perfectly engineered house of horrors. Imagine walking through a 3-story maze, where every corner hides a new nightmare. Every door leads to uncertainty, and the walls themselves seem to whisper dark secrets. Welcome to the murder castle, where the architecture was designed not just to deceive but to kill. Holmes' Hotel was built on a bustling street corner in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago. At first glance, it looked like any other building sprouting up during the city's construction boom in the lead-up to the 1893 World's Fair. But for those who worked on the project, it quickly became clear that this was no ordinary construction site. Holmes began with a simple blueprint, showing a modest 2-story building with shops on the ground floor and apartments above. But as the construction progressed, Holmes kept adding more and more modifications. He would call on an architect, lay out plans, then abruptly fire him before the job was completed. Then, he'd hire a new one, making sure none of the designers ever had a full picture of what he was building. It was a clever ploy to ensure that only he knew the true layout of the structure. As for the construction workers, they never stayed long. Holmes had a knack for hiring a revolving door of employees, each only working on small sections of the building before being let go. The workers must have thought it strange, walls being built and torn down, staircases leading to nowhere, and rooms with no windows or doors. They were tasked with constructing soundproof chambers and hidden trapdoors, but didn't question why a hotel would need such bizarre features. If they did, they didn't dare ask Holmes. After all, he was charming and persuasive, always quick with a smile and a promise of payment, though the money often never came. The truth was, Holmes funded his murder castle through a web of lies and deceit. He conned suppliers, stiffed contractors, and swindled investors. With a calm demeanor and a knack for manipulation, he convinced people to extend credit, only to vanish before payment was due. Banks, investors, and suppliers all became unknowing participants in the creation of this deadly lair. Holmes' finances were as twisted as the corridors of his castle. But what exactly did Holmes build with all this deception and trickery? The murder castle was a testament to his monstrous mind. Imagine stepping through its front doors, only to find yourself in a disorienting labyrinth. There were hallways that led to nowhere, staircases that doubled back on themselves, and doors that opened to reveal solid brick walls. It was a disorienting, dizzying maze, and that was only the beginning. Holmes' favorite guests were led to rooms with special features like airtight seals and gas fixtures. These rooms looked like any other hotel room, but with a sinister twist. Holmes could turn a valve and fill the room with gas, suffocating the victim inside. And if they tried to scream, no one would hear them. The walls were lined with asbestos, soundproof to contain the desperate cries of those inside. For others, the trapdoors and secret passages were their doom. A guest could be standing on what seemed like solid ground one moment and plummeting down a chute the next, landing in the basement where Holmes would process them. Some rooms had floors that tilted, sending those inside sliding down into a dark pit below. Once they were in the basement, their fate was sealed. The basement of the murder castle was a macabre workshop. Holmes outfitted it with vats of acid, a dissection table, and even a crematorium. This was where the real horror took place. It was his personal playground for experimentation and disposal. He would strip flesh from bone, cut up bodies with surgical precision, and dissolve what remained in the acid vats. The worst part? He sometimes sold the clean skeletons to medical schools, making a profit off the very bones of his victims. During the construction phase, strange things began to happen around the murder castle. Workers reported hearing noises, unexplained whispers that seemed to come from within the walls. Tools would go missing, only to turn up later in rooms that hadn't even been built yet. Some workers spoke of a heavy, oppressive feeling that lingered in the air, as if the building itself were alive, feeding off the energy of those toiling within it. And then there were the disappearances. Holmes' revolving door of workers meant that it was easy for someone to vanish without raising suspicion. A carpenter didn't show up one day, and everyone assumed he'd just moved on to another job. A bricklayer went home one night and never returned. No one batted an eye. Chicago was a transient city, and people came and went all the time. But the truth was far more sinister. Holmes had begun experimenting, even before the castle was completed. Workers who were too nosy or who started asking questions often found themselves on the receiving end of Holmes' experiments. They were his early victims, those unlucky enough to be caught within the walls of a building designed for death. The strangest incident of all involved a young architect's apprentice. He had been working late one evening, sketching out some of the bizarre modifications Holmes demanded. The next morning, the foreman found his drawings crumpled on the floor, the pencil snapped in half. The apprentice was gone. His tools were left behind. His coat still hung on the hook by the door. But there was no trace of him. When the foreman asked Holmes if he knew anything, the good doctor just smiled and said, "I'm sure he'll turn up eventually." He never did. By the time the murder castle was finished, it had become a living, breathing monster, its walls soaked with malice. Holmes stood in the grand lobby, surveying his creation with satisfaction. Every room, every hidden passage, every trapdoor was precisely where he wanted it. This was no ordinary hotel. It was a machine of death, designed for one purpose only: to trap, kill, and dispose of anyone unfortunate enough to enter. The 1893 World's Fair would bring thousands of unsuspecting people to Chicago, each one a potential victim. And Holmes, standing in the shadows of his murderous creation, was ready to welcome them with open arms. The murder castle was complete, and soon it would begin its reign of terror. Chapter 3. A House of Horrors. Walking into H.H. Holmes' hotel, you'd be forgiven for thinking it looked perfectly normal. There was a grand reception area, polished wood floors, and plush carpeting. The air smelled faintly of lavender, and the chandeliers cast a warm, welcoming glow. But the welcoming facade was only skin deep. This wasn't just a hotel, it was a nightmare factory. Every room was designed to deceive, disorient, and destroy. Holmes had poured his dark genius into creating a labyrinthine death trap, a place where every turn could lead to unspeakable horrors. Let's step inside and take a closer look at this house of horrors, room by room. The lobby and reception area. The lobby seemed ordinary enough, a place where weary travelers might check in for a night's rest. Holmes himself often greeted guests here, his disarming smile and courteous demeanor putting them at ease. But behind the counter, there were hidden buttons and levers. With just a flick of his finger, Holmes could seal a room shut, cut off air supply, or activate gas fixtures to release a deadly mist into the guest rooms above. The lobby led into a maze of hallways, some of which had false doors or dead ends, giving the impression that the hotel was far larger than it actually was. Once a guest turned a wrong corner, it was all too easy to get lost, exactly as Holmes intended. Those who dared to call for help would find no one answered. The walls, thick and soundproofed, swallowed up their cries like a black hole. The hallways of deception. Every hallway in the murder castle was a puzzle. Some were fitted with hidden trapdoors, others with panels that swung open to reveal passageways leading straight to the basement. Holmes knew the layout intimately. He had designed it to confuse even the most perceptive visitor. It was said that he would stand quietly in the shadows, watching as his victims roamed the corridors, panic building as they realized they couldn't find their way out. Survivors, if you could call them that, spoke of walking in circles for hours, their fear mounting with every dead end and locked door. Some hallways were lined with gaslights that Holmes could extinguish with the press of a button, plunging the unfortunate wanderer into pitch darkness. In those moments, it wasn't the physical pain that drove his victims to despair, but the overwhelming sense of hopelessness. They were trapped, alone in the dark, with no way out and no one coming to save them. The airtight vault. Perhaps the most terrifying room in the entire castle was the airtight vault. It looked like a simple storage closet, unassuming and plain. But once inside, the door could be sealed shut, trapping anyone within. Holmes had designed it with a series of steel plates and locks, ensuring that no amount of banging or screaming could be heard from the outside. The walls were so thick that even a gunshot would be muffled to a faint pop. Holmes used the vault as his personal execution chamber. He would lure victims inside under the pretense of showing them a secure room for their valuables. Once the door clanged shut, the true horror began. There was no escape, no oxygen, just the agonizing wait as the air grew thin and the temperature dropped. Holmes often stood outside the door, listening to the frantic gasping and scratching from within, a sadistic smile playing on his lips. The asphyxiation rooms. Several guest rooms were equipped with their own unique, horrifying features. Holmes called these his asphyxiation rooms. Each was fitted with hidden gas lines that Holmes could activate from his office. A victim would be asleep, or perhaps lying in bed reading, when they'd start to feel lightheaded. Panic would set in as the gas crept into the room, silently and invisibly. Holmes had a peephole in each room, allowing him to watch as his victims struggled to breathe, clawing at the walls and furniture in desperation. Holmes' control over the entire building meant that no one ever knew when they might be targeted. His victims ranged from hotel guests to his own employees, young women who had come to Chicago looking for work, only to find themselves at the mercy of a man without a shred of humanity. For them, the asphyxiation rooms were a one-way ticket to oblivion. The trapdoor to hell. Some rooms had trapdoors hidden beneath the carpet. A slight pressure on the wrong floorboard, and the ground would disappear beneath your feet. These trapdoors led straight down to the basement, a veritable hellhole. Victims would tumble down a chute, their screams reverberating off the walls as they were swallowed by darkness. The fall would often break bones, leaving them helpless and injured in a place where no one could hear them. Holmes kept his basement meticulously clean, the floors scrubbed to remove any trace of blood or gore. It was here that he dissected bodies, stripped flesh from bone, and disposed of the remains. There were vats of acid for dissolving flesh, a furnace for burning bones, and surgical tables for more hands-on work. The basement smelled of chemicals and burnt hair, a sickening stench that lingered long after the bodies were gone. The secret passages. Secret passages crisscrossed the entire building, allowing Holmes to move about unseen. He could observe his victims from behind false walls or hidden alcoves, his eyes gleaming with sadistic glee as he watched their terror unfold. One passage even had a sliding panel that opened directly into a guest room. He would sneak in quietly, stand over a sleeping victim, and then decide whether to let them wake up or not. The psychological impact of these rooms was devastating. Victims were stripped not just of their lives, but of their sanity. Those who weren't killed immediately were often kept in tiny, lightless rooms, starved, beaten, and driven to madness. Holmes broke them down piece by piece, until they were barely human, just husks of their former selves. Testimonies from the brave few. There were few who survived Holmes' castle of horrors, but the testimonies of those who did are chilling. One young woman, who managed to escape after Holmes had locked her in a small, dark closet for hours, later told police she had felt her sanity slipping. The darkness had seemed alive, whispering to her, driving her to the brink of hysteria. She'd clawed at the walls, screaming until her throat bled, certain she'd never see the light of day again. When the police finally uncovered the true extent of Holmes' monstrous creation, they were horrified. One officer described it as a house built for the devil himself. Another said he'd never seen such a place outside of his worst nightmares. The castle was dismantled piece by piece, but its horrors live on, a testament to the evil that can hide behind even the most charming of smiles. Chapter 4. The victims and disappearances. The murder castle wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was a place soaked in despair, its very walls whispering the names of those who never made it out alive. Holmes' victims were more than just statistics. They were real people with dreams, hopes, and families. Young women looking to make a fresh start, guests who thought they were checking into a safe haven, employees who simply showed up for work, all lured by the smiling face of a man who seemed trustworthy and kind. But behind those twinkling eyes and that polished demeanor lay the heart of a monster. The lured and the lost. Holmes' victims came from all walks of life, but most shared one thing in common. They were vulnerable. Some were alone in a bustling city far from home. Others were caught in desperate situations. Holmes had a keen sense for spotting these individuals, zeroing in on those he knew he could control and deceive with his charm. Let's take a look at some of his known victims, each one with a story that ended far too soon. Julia Smythe and Pearl Connor. Julia was a young, attractive woman who had recently separated from her husband. She moved to Chicago with her daughter Pearl, hoping for a fresh start. She found work at Holmes' pharmacy and, before long, found herself falling for the charming doctor. Holmes promised her a better life, even a new beginning for her and little Pearl. But soon, Julia became just another pawn in his game. She and her daughter disappeared without a trace. The last time anyone saw them, they were headed up to the second floor of the hotel. They were never seen again. It was later revealed that Holmes had used Julia's trust in him to lure her into one of his special rooms. As for Pearl, the innocent little girl, she likely met a tragic fate in the basement. It's believed Holmes killed her quickly, perhaps in an effort to cover his tracks. When asked about the mother and daughter, Holmes smiled and told people they had gone back to visit family. No one questioned it at the time, but the truth was far darker. Emmeline Sigrand. Emmeline was another young woman, fresh-faced and hopeful. She moved to Chicago after Holmes promised her a job as his personal secretary. He lavished her with attention, gifts, and sweet promises, all the while plotting her demise. Once Emmeline fell under his spell, Holmes wasted no time in luring her into one of his airtight vaults under the pretense of showing her a safe place for their future valuables. By the time she realized what was happening, it was too late. Her death was slow and agonizing, as the air slowly left the sealed room. Afterwards, Holmes disposed of her body in the basement. He went on to calmly tell anyone who asked that she had left town to get married. It was a lie he used frequently, knowing full well that no one would ever see her again. Ned Connor and the Connor family. Ned Connor was a jeweler who moved to Chicago with his wife, Julia, and their young daughter, Pearl, seeking employment. Holmes hired him to work at the jewelry counter of his drugstore, all the while seducing his wife behind his back. Ned suspected something wasn't right, and before long, the marriage crumbled. He left Chicago, abandoning Julia and Pearl in the care of Holmes. Ned couldn't have known that his decision would seal his family's fate. After he left, Holmes set his sights on Julia and Pearl, promising them a bright future. He told Julia he would marry her, and she believed him. But it was all part of his twisted game. After their disappearance, Ned returned, only to be told that his wife and daughter had moved on. He never saw them again. The guilt and regret of abandoning them to a predator like Holmes haunted Ned for the rest of his life. Minnie and Nanny Williams. Minnie Williams was a young woman from Texas, wealthy and eager for adventure. She came to Chicago with her sister Nanny, intending to start a new life. Holmes charmed Minnie with ease, persuading her to sign over the deed to a property she owned in Fort Worth, Texas. He even proposed marriage to Minnie, further deepening her trust in him. Nanny, on the other hand, was skeptical of Holmes and his intentions, but she was silenced before she could interfere. Holmes convinced the sisters to move into the murder castle, under the guise of giving them a place to stay while preparing for the wedding. But once there, Nanny vanished. When Minnie questioned her whereabouts, Holmes concocted a story that her sister had left suddenly. In truth, Nanny was probably gassed to death or dropped down one of the chutes to the basement. Not long after, Minnie also disappeared. Holmes' explanation was the same as always. She'd left to visit friends. He didn't even bother to keep up the pretense for long. Once they were out of the way, Holmes sold off their belongings and pocketed the money. The web of deceit. Holmes knew how to play on people's emotions. He made promises of love, marriage, and wealth, knowing full well he had no intention of keeping any of them. For some victims, he offered employment and security, a chance to rise above their circumstances. For others, he feigned romantic interest, his charisma weaving a spell around them until they were completely under his control. It wasn't just women who fell into Holmes' web. He had a particular interest in hiring young male workers for the murder castle, only to fire them abruptly or ensure they vanished without a trace. It's believed that some of these men stumbled upon the true nature of his construction: trapdoors, soundproof rooms, and passages leading directly to the basement. Those who asked too many questions never made it out. The aftermath. The families of Holmes' victims suffered unimaginable grief. Most of them never knew what had happened to their loved ones. They received letters promising a return that never came, or telegrams with vague explanations. Holmes was meticulous about covering his tracks, creating false trails and misleading correspondence to give the appearance that his victims had simply moved on. In the aftermath of his capture and the subsequent investigation into the murder castle, families came forward, desperate for answers. Some wanted to believe that their daughters or sisters had simply run away, unable to bear the thought of the alternative. But as more bodies were unearthed, and the horrific details of what Holmes had done came to light, hope turned to despair. The psychological impact on the community was profound. Holmes' crime shattered the illusion of safety in Chicago, leaving a scar that would never fully heal. The newspapers dubbed him the Devil in the White City, a fitting moniker for a man who preyed on innocence and trust. The true number of his victims may never be known, but each one left behind a ripple of sadness and horror that echoes to this day. The murder castle was torn down, and the site was eventually rebuilt. But the memory of what happened there lingers, a silent reminder that evil often hides behind the most charming of masks. Chapter 5. The downfall and capture of H. Holmes. Even the cleverest of devils eventually stumble, and H. Holmes was no exception. His undoing began not with the murders or his macabre castle of horrors, but rather with the very same thing that had fueled his rise to infamy: greed. It was his web of fraudulent schemes and financial deceptions that first drew the authorities' attention to him. You see, Holmes was not just a killer. He was a con artist of the highest order, and he simply couldn't resist squeezing every last drop of profit out of anyone foolish enough to trust him. Holmes had always been running one scheme or another bilking creditors, forging signatures, and manipulating anyone he could get his hooks into. But as his debts began to mount and the bodies in his castle basement piled up, his lies started to unravel. One by one, business partners, investors, and banks began to realize they had been taken for a ride, but by the time they caught on, Holmes was already planning his next move. The breaking point came when he concocted an insurance scam so elaborate, even he struggled to keep track of it. Holmes roped in one of his longtime associates, Benjamin Pitzel, in a plot to fake Pitzel's death and cash in on a $10,000 life insurance policy. The plan was simple, or at least that's what Holmes led Pitzel to believe. Pitzel would go into hiding while Holmes substituted a cadaver in his place. Holmes would collect the insurance money, and they'd split it. But for Holmes, dead men tell no tales. Rather than use a cadaver, he killed Pitzel himself, setting up the scene to look like an accidental death caused by an explosion in Pitzel's laboratory. With Pitzel out of the way, Holmes collected the payout with ease. Holmes might have gotten away with it too, if he hadn't made one fatal mistake. He chose to involve Pitzel's wife, Carrie, and their 3 children in the scheme. Telling Carrie that her husband was still alive and in hiding, Holmes convinced her to allow him to take custody of her children while she made her way to meet him. One by one, Holmes moved Pitzel's children around the country, playing a sick game of hide-and-seek. He separated the family, taking the children to different cities, all the while sending Carrie reassuring letters that they would be reunited with their father soon. What Holmes didn't know was that the Pinkerton National Detective Agency had already begun to investigate him. Suspicious insurance agents, along with local law enforcement, had enlisted the help of the Pinkertons, famed for their relentless pursuit of criminals. Once on Holmes' trail, they didn't let go. Detectives tracked his movements as he hopped from city to city, leaving a trail of false identities and mounting debts behind him. As the Pinkertons closed in, Holmes grew more erratic. He must have known that his game was up, but instead of fleeing the country or going underground, he did something utterly monstrous. He killed 2 of the Pitzel children, Alice and Nellie, stuffing their tiny bodies into a trunk and burying it in the basement of a rented house in Toronto. He then moved on to Philadelphia with the youngest, Howard, whom he also killed in cold blood. By this time, the Pinkertons were hot on his trail. Holmes had become careless, leaving clues in his wake. It was only a matter of time before they caught up to him. On November 17, 1894, in Boston, Holmes was finally apprehended. There he was, standing on a street corner, looking every bit the calm, collected doctor he had always pretended to be. He didn't struggle when the detectives slapped the handcuffs on him, nor did he try to talk his way out of it. He simply smiled, a smile that chilled the detectives to their bones. Holmes was initially arrested for the insurance fraud involving Pitzel's death, but as detectives delved deeper into his past, the true horror of what he had done began to unfold. It wasn't long before the authorities learned that Pitzel was truly dead, and not from an accident. Holmes had murdered him. The shocking revelations didn't end there. As they followed Holmes' trail back to Chicago and the murder castle, they uncovered a grisly scene. Police and detectives explored the murder castle, uncovering a nightmarish tangle of secret rooms, chutes, and chambers. The building seemed alive with malevolence, as if the walls themselves held the memories of the screams that had echoed through its halls. The authorities found evidence of the missing women and children Holmes had lured to their deaths. Human remains, bone fragments, bloodstains, and scraps of clothing confirmed the worst fears. Holmes was not just a con man or a fraudster. He was a serial killer on a scale the country had never seen. Holmes' trial in Philadelphia was nothing short of sensational. Newspapers across the nation dubbed him the Devil in the White City, and his face became infamous. People couldn't believe that a man who looked so respectable and refined could be capable of such depravity. The courtroom was packed every day, spectators craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the man who had built a house of horrors. And through it all, Holmes remained the picture of calm composure. He represented himself during parts of the trial, weaving stories that were equal parts outlandish and chilling. Holmes denied everything, then confessed to some things, then contradicted himself again and again. He seemed to take pleasure in the confusion and chaos he sowed. He would smile at the jury, wink at reporters, and make bizarre statements about his own innocence and the vast conspiracies against him. At one point, he even claimed to be possessed by a demon, one that compelled him to kill. But no amount of charm or manipulation could save him now. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the jury took little time to convict him. On May 7, 1896, H. Holmes was sentenced to death by hanging. Even then, he seemed unbothered, almost indifferent. He maintained his cool demeanor right up until the noose was slipped around his neck. As he stood on the gallows, Holmes reportedly smiled one last time, saying, "I was born with the devil in me." When the trapdoor swung open, H. Holmes, the devil in the White City, met his end. But even death couldn't erase the terror he had inflicted. His legend lives on, a cautionary tale of how evil can wear the most charming of masks. To this day, the Murder Castle and its twisted corridors remain a dark part of Chicago's history, a reminder of the horrors one man can inflict when the world fails to see the devil lurking beneath the surface. Chapter 6. Inside the mind of a monster. To look at H. Holmes, you'd see a man who seemed perfectly normal. He was well-dressed, well-spoken, and highly intelligent, a true gentleman in every sense of the word. He could charm the sternest of men, seduce the most skeptical of women, and talk his way out of almost any situation. But behind that polished exterior lay a mind twisted beyond comprehension. So, what drove Holmes to commit such unspeakable acts? What darkness lurked in the corners of his mind? When trying to understand Holmes, it's crucial to remember that he wasn't just a cold-blooded murderer. He was something far more sinister. He was a master of deception, a predator who used charm and wit as his weapons of choice. Holmes fits the profile of what modern experts would call a psychopath, someone who lacks empathy, feels no guilt, and views others not as people, but as tools to be used and discarded. Psychopaths are often extremely manipulative, and Holmes was no exception. He had an almost supernatural ability to appear kind and trustworthy, making his victims feel safe even as he plotted their demise. He could switch from smiling and charming one moment to ice-cold and calculating the next, his emotions as fake as the names and identities he cycled through. This ability to shift between personas made him almost invisible, a wolf in sheep's clothing, slipping through society's cracks undetected. But Holmes wasn't born a monster. He was made one. His early life was marked by a strange combination of isolation and terror. Born as Herman Webster Mudgett in 1861, he grew up in a small New Hampshire town. Even as a child, he was different. Neighbors described him as unusually quiet, often lost in his own thoughts. But there were rumors, too. Rumors of cruelty, of animals found mutilated in the woods, of a young boy who seemed to take pleasure in the suffering of others. One pivotal moment in Holmes' childhood might hold a clue to his later transformation. When he was a boy, older children in his town dragged him into a doctor's office, forcing him to confront his fear of skeletons. They pushed him toward a human skeleton, its hollow eye sockets staring down at him. Young Herman screamed, expecting the fear to overwhelm him. But something unexpected happened. He felt a strange, perverse fascination. The skeleton that should have terrified him instead intrigued him. From that day forward, death no longer frightened him. It became his obsession. Modern psychologists would call Holmes' condition antisocial personality disorder, characterized by a lack of empathy, a disregard for social norms, and an inability to form genuine emotional attachments. In Holmes' case, his condition manifested not only in his willingness to kill, but also in his need to control, deceive, and manipulate. He didn't just want to end lives, he wanted to own them, to possess them utterly before snuffing them out. Holmes' calm demeanor, even when describing his heinous acts, points to another terrifying trait: a complete absence of remorse. During his trial, Holmes spoke of his murders with a detachment that left witnesses horrified. He described his methods not with horror or regret, but with a clinical precision, as if he were discussing nothing more consequential than a recipe for stew. He showed no sign of guilt or shame, no indication that he even understood why others found his actions so monstrous. This lack of guilt and remorse is a hallmark of the psychopathic mind. Holmes viewed his victims as pawns in his game, their lives and deaths merely part of a larger puzzle he was piecing together. He used them to fulfill his desires, whether that meant financial gain, intellectual stimulation, or the sheer thrill of having power over another person's fate. One of the most striking aspects of Holmes' psychology is his duality. He lived a double life, one as a respected businessman, a doctor, and a man of society, the other as a remorseless killer who delighted in watching his victims suffer. He compartmentalized these two sides so effectively that even those closest to him never suspected the truth. To his neighbors, Holmes was a successful entrepreneur, a man who owned property and provided jobs. To his acquaintances, he was a charming, intelligent man, always ready with a joke or a smile. But behind closed doors, he became something else entirely. In the privacy of his murder castle, he was in control. He reveled in his power to decide who lived and who died, creating an environment that reflected the twisted corridors of his own mind. Each hidden passage, each trapdoor and airtight room, was a physical manifestation of his psyche, a labyrinth designed to confuse, entrap, and ultimately destroy. It's possible that Holmes' insatiable need for control stemmed from his early experiences. His childhood was dominated by a strict, authoritarian father who demanded obedience and perfection. Holmes may have developed a deep-seated need to exert power over others as a way to compensate for the powerlessness he felt as a child. Or perhaps it was simply that he never saw other people as real, never felt the warmth of human connection. Another factor to consider is Holmes' intelligence. He wasn't just a brute who killed for pleasure. He was a highly educated man who studied medicine and chemistry. His knowledge allowed him to kill in ways that were precise and efficient. He knew how to manipulate the human body, how to inflict pain, and how to hide evidence. But it wasn't just his academic intelligence that set him apart, it was his emotional intelligence. Holmes knew exactly how to play on people's emotions, how to read their fears and desires, and how to use that information to his advantage. Holmes' education and intellect also made him arrogant. He believed himself to be superior to those around him, and in many ways he was. He evaded suspicion for so long because he saw through the weaknesses in the system. He knew how to lie convincingly, how to shift blame, and how to play on people's prejudices and expectations. It was this combination of intelligence, charm, and ruthlessness that made him such an effective killer. In the end, Holmes' story is one of a man who was both brilliant and depraved, who saw himself as above the laws that govern ordinary mortals. He didn't kill out of passion or desperation. He killed because he wanted to, because he could, and that perhaps is the most frightening thing of all. Understanding H. Holmes means confronting the fact that evil can wear a friendly face, that a monster can hide behind the guise of respectability. He wasn't some shadowy figure lurking in the dark. He was the man tipping his hat to you on the street, the doctor taking your pulse, the hotel owner offering you a room. And that's what makes his story so terrifying. It's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look just like us. Chapter 7. The legacy of the murder castle. H. Holmes may have met his end on the gallows, but his legacy, the terror he sowed, and the macabre masterpiece he constructed, lives on. The murder castle, with its twisting hallways and trap-filled rooms, became a symbol of pure evil, the blueprint for every haunted house and villainous lair in horror fiction. Long after Holmes' body swung lifeless from the noose, the building itself continued to cast a dark shadow over Chicago. But what happened to the murder castle after its creator was gone? Did it stand there, empty and brooding, a grim reminder of what one man's twisted mind could conceive? Or did it vanish into the ether, taking its secrets with it? The answer, like much of Holmes' story, is wrapped in mystery and intrigue. After Holmes' arrest, the castle quickly became the stuff of legend. People flocked to it, morbid curiosity driving them to glimpse the place where so many lives had been lost. The public couldn't get enough of the gruesome details. The airtight vaults, the greased chutes that sent bodies plummeting to the basement, the strange sounds that still seemed to echo through the walls. Reporters called it the House of Horrors and the Castle of Death. It was said that even hardened police officers felt uneasy walking through its corridors, the very air thick with the memory of what had happened there. Almost immediately, the murder castle became a tourist attraction. People from all over paid good money to tour the place where Holmes had carried out his heinous deeds. They wandered through the rooms, staring at the trapdoors and secret passages, imagining the screams that had echoed through the halls. Some claimed they could still hear the voices of the victims, faint cries coming from behind the walls. Others said they saw ghostly figures moving through the shadowy corners, disappearing when approached. But the public's fascination soon turned sour. The castle had become more than just a grim curiosity. It was an affront to the community. No one wanted to live near it, and even passing by seemed to give people a sense of unease. Neighbors whispered that the building was cursed, that it was drawing people in like a black hole, feeding off the fear and revulsion it inspired. In 1895, just a year after Holmes' execution, the murder castle was set ablaze under mysterious circumstances. Flames licked at the walls, devouring the twisted architecture that Holmes had designed. The building burned for hours, finally collapsing in on itself like a wounded beast. The fire destroyed much of the structure, but not the basement. The charred ruins were left standing for years before the land was eventually sold. Today, the site of the murder castle is occupied by a mundane building, a post office of all things. But some say that the ground still holds its dark history, that strange things happen in the basement of that post office. Employees have reported eerie sensations, unexplained noises, and the feeling of being watched. Perhaps the souls of Holmes' victims are still trapped there, forever bound to the place where their lives were brutally cut short. While the building itself may be gone, Holmes' story has refused to die. His name, his crimes, and his murder castle have become etched into the fabric of American crime history. Holmes wasn't just a murderer. He was America's first documented serial killer, the prototype for every deranged criminal mastermind to follow. He was a precursor to the likes of Jack the Ripper, Ted Bundy, and the Zodiac Killer. The Holmes case set a precedent for how the public and law enforcement viewed such criminals. His trial was one of the first to delve into the psyche of a killer, raising questions about the nature of evil and the psychology behind such heinous acts. Holmes wasn't just seen as a man who killed for money or revenge. He was viewed as a new breed of killer, one who took pleasure in the suffering of others, who killed because he wanted to. His crimes pushed the boundaries of investigative techniques at the time. Detectives, baffled by his ability to evade capture and by the sheer scope of his evil, had to rethink how they approached crime scenes and suspects. The hunt for Holmes required cooperation across state lines, something that was almost unheard of back then. It highlighted the need for better communication between law enforcement agencies and helped lay the groundwork for modern-day criminal profiling and forensic investigation. And what of Holmes himself? Was his death the end of his story? Or were there more secrets left buried in the ashes of the murder castle? To this day, questions linger. Some believe that Holmes didn't act alone, that there were accomplices who helped him carry out his dark deeds. Others speculate that Holmes had far more victims than those officially listed, perhaps hundreds more. The layout of the castle, with its maze-like structure and countless hidden compartments, suggests that Holmes had practiced his craft on many more unfortunate souls. There's also the tantalizing theory that Holmes' death wasn't the end at all. Some say that he faked his own execution, substituting another body for his own, and escaped to continue his killing spree under a new identity. It sounds outlandish, but then again, Holmes was a master of deceit. He was known to adopt aliases and wear disguises, and he was never short on schemes to evade capture. Could it be that he managed to pull off one final trick, leaving the world to believe that the devil in the White City was no more while he lived on in the shadows? The physical evidence is gone, the murder castle reduced to rubble and dust. But the stories persist. The legacy of H. Holmes lives on, not just in books and movies, but in the way we think about serial killers, in the way we fear the monsters that hide behind charming smiles and polite conversation. Holmes' influence can be seen in countless fictional villains, each one drawing a little from the man who turned murder into an art form. The murder castle itself may be gone, but its memory lingers like a ghost, haunting the corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street. People still visit the site, hoping to feel some connection to the past, to catch a glimpse of the horror that once stood there. Some say you can still sense it, the lingering darkness that no fire could cleanse, a cold shiver that runs down your spine as you stand on that cursed ground. Holmes may have been executed, but his evil lives on, forever entangled in the annals of American history. His name is whispered like a curse, a reminder that monsters are real, and sometimes they build castles to trap us in their nightmares.